China continues to score economic wins while Trump insists he still has control. But behind the political drama and tariff disputes, a much larger shift is taking place. Beijing is quietly redrawing the global balance of power, not through military force, but by securing the trade routes and resources that keep world commerce running. Chinese port authorities have begun raising fees on foreign vessels, small policy changes that slowly test how far Washington will tolerate economic pressure. These minor adjustments echo across the supply chain, pushing up shipping costs, delaying cargo, and squeezing American exporters already weighed down by tariffs. What looks like routine port management is gradually turning into a tool of influence, an economic pressure point sharper than tariffs themselves. Every time the U.S. issues a new trade strike, China answers with a targeted move of its own. The challenge for America is that its economy relies heavily on those same sea lanes to move energy, food, and manufactured goods, and many of the world's key maritime choke points are now tied to Chinese investment. What began as a tariff dispute has evolved into a struggle for dominance over the channels of global trade. And this time, the opening blow didn't come from Washington. It came from the ocean. The shock in Washington intensified after China announced a $56 fee per metric ton on American ships entering its ports. The number seems small, but applied across global trade routes, it becomes immensely costly. Shipping firms are already predicting monthly losses in the hundreds of millions, and exporters brace for slower deliveries and rising expenses. The fee's real power lies not in the amount, but in the reach of China's network. State-owned companies now hold stakes in more than 110 ports across 67 nations, from Colombo to Piraeus, Gwadar to Antwerp. These facilities are not just docks, they are strategic nodes in China's Belt and Road network, a web Beijing can tighten whenever strategy demands. If similar levies spread to partner ports, American ships could face added costs throughout Asia, Africa, Europe, and Latin America. Each additional charge raises insurance rates, forces route changes, and drives up export prices, a blow to U.S. farmers, manufacturers, and carriers already struggling under tariff losses. Meanwhile, Chinese cargo moves smoothly through its own protected network. What appears to be global trade is actually global leverage. Where the U.S. established influence through military bases, China is building it through ports, cranes, and logistics deals. While Washington debates sanctions, Beijing expands its maritime reach. From open sea routes to the minerals beneath them, China is tightening its hold on the foundations of the world economy, and another front is quietly emerging out of sight. Tensions sharpened further as China began restricting exports of rare earth elements, the 17 vital metals that power modern technology, EVs, smartphones, aircraft engines, and even advanced weapons. China controls most of the supply. Recently, it has limited export permits for materials like gallium and germanium, which are crucial for semiconductors and high-tech defense systems. The U.S. reaction has been urgent. Trump and his advisors have rushed to secure stakes in rare earth mines from Africa to Australia, hoping to reduce reliance on China. Markets surged overnight, with some rare earth companies seeing stock prices triple. Yet the real obstacle isn't mining, it's processing. China handles 90–95% of global refining, the step that transforms raw ore into useful materials. Trump promises the U.S. will soon overflow with rare earth supply. But that vision overlooks a hard fact. Extracting minerals is easy compared to refining them. Even if new mines open, much of the output would still need processing in China. Without refining capacity, these minerals remain worthless rock. Building U.S. refineries is slow, expensive, technically demanding, and constrained by environmental regulations. Each facility can take 7 years and hundreds of millions to develop. China, meanwhile, refines faster and cheaper with full state support. This is why America's goal of rare earth independence keeps hitting the same wall. Almost every solution still leads back to Beijing. As prices rise and supplies shrink, industries from chip makers to automakers to defense contractors are feeling the pressure. This battle is not about digging minerals. It's about controlling the technology and infrastructure that make them valuable. And while Washington searches for alternatives, China continues to reinforce its advantage. The crisis is also hitting America's agricultural heartland. Trump's latest demands to Beijing, stop fentanyl flows, resume soybean purchases, and lift rare earth export limits, have met no response. Since June, China's imports of U.S. soybeans have dropped to nearly zero, and rural communities are bearing the consequences. For millions of farmers, soybeans are not just crops. They are the economic backbone of their livelihoods. Without Chinese buying, one of America's largest agricultural sectors is collapsing. China once purchased more than 30 million tons of U.S. soybeans each year. Now it buys record amounts from Brazil and Argentina, erasing an estimated $12.6 billion in U.S. farm income across states like Iowa, Illinois, and Kansas. This is not a theoretical policy issue. It's a survival crisis for entire regions. What started as a tariff battle has expanded into a competition over trade routes, vital minerals, and even the food grown in American fields. Beijing isn't simply challenging U.S. power. It is methodically rewriting the global rules one port, one shipment, and one resource at a time. What began as a show of American strength, a push to bring manufacturing home and punish China, has slowly reversed. Between tariffs, boycotts, and emergency bailouts, the damage has drifted back toward the United States, leaving harvests across the Midwest sitting unsold and rotting in silos. Across America's farm belt, mountains of soybeans sit untouched in silos, crops that once moved directly to Chinese buyers, but today have nowhere to go. For countless farmers, this isn't just a rough year. It's the difference between keeping the family land or watching generations of work disappear. Washington has tried to fill the gap, pushing out tens of billions of dollars in emergency relief. If the trade conflict continues, the total bill could climb past $60 billion. Yet those payments barely make a dent. They don't reverse collapsing crop prices. They don't erase rising debt. And for many farmers, they don't even cover the cost of keeping unsold grain in storage. Many remember the promises, speeches assuring them that China would return as a buyer, that new deals were just around the corner, that shipments would resume as before, but that before belongs to a world that doesn't exist anymore. Today's landscape is shaped by 100% tariffs, political tensions woven into supply chains, and a global backlash that has rewired trade routes. Chinese importers have moved on. They've locked in long-term supply contracts with Brazil, expanded processing capacity across Asia, and rebuilt the global grain network in a way that no longer depends on U.S. farms. Even if relations thaw, the new trade paths are permanent. What the U.S. lost wasn't simply a customer. It was a structural pillar supporting its agricultural economy. This farm crisis is only the visible part of a much deeper economic loop. Beneath it lies a silent tax created by tariffs, one that affects nearly every American household. Tariffs were advertised as a way to make China pay. Instead, the costs are embedded in every shipment that arrives at a U.S. port. Importers absorb the tariff, then pass it to retailers. Retailers pass it to consumers already stretched thin by high inflation. Government filings show tariff collections touching nearly $30 billion in a single month, putting the U.S. on track for more than $300 billion a year by 2026. At first glance, that number looks like financial strength, until you ask where the money actually comes from. It isn't coming from Beijing, it's coming from millions of Americans at the checkout counter. Washington collects these funds, and then cycles them back out in the form of aid to industries harmed by the very tariffs that generated the revenue in the first place. It's an economic loop. Consumers pay more, the government gathers the difference, and then writes bailout checks to the regions hit hardest. Meanwhile, China's support for its industries comes from record trade surpluses, not borrowed money. That contrast shapes endurance. One country invests earnings, the other relies on debt. Each year, that disparity grows more pronounced. The trade war was meant to pressure Beijing, but over time it evolved into a slow-moving domestic tax that raises costs throughout U.S. supply chains and inflates prices at home. The image of victory has masked a harsher truth. While America grapples with the consequences, China's industrial machine keeps expanding. Yes, Chinese exports to the U.S. have fallen by about 25% since their 2022 peak. But globally, Chinese exports are hitting new all-time highs. Beijing has simply redirected its trade flows towards Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, and other emerging markets. These shifts preserved an enormous $800 billion trade surplus that now fuels domestic manufacturing, scientific research, and infrastructure. China doesn't need to borrow to build. The country's bond yields remain below 2.5%, backed by steady investor confidence. In contrast, U.S. yields hover around 4.6%, while national debt has surged past $35 trillion. Every rise in interest rates adds tens of billions in yearly costs, money that could have been invested in innovation, education, or rebuilding the country's foundations. The divergence is striking. China's development model, produce, export, invest, continues expanding. America's model, borrow, consume, repeat, is beginning to show clear strain. Harvard's Growth Lab reports a dramatic shift. China's industrial complexity ranking has risen from 37th in 1995 to nearly matching the United States by 2023. Its manufacturing capabilities now stretch from electric vehicle batteries to advanced AI hardware. At the same time, U.S. manufacturers face higher operating costs, tariff burdens, and fierce competition from abroad. For every policy announcement in Washington, China breaks ground on another factory. For every press briefing, another ship sails from Shenzhen toward a freshly developed market. And as the U.S. struggles with its own constraints, Europe is drifting into a similar dilemma. The Dutch government recently seized control of Nexperia, a semiconductor company with Chinese ownership, citing national security concerns. The move was intended to show strength, but may end up complicating Europe's technological future. China's response was restrained but pointed. Officials warned that such actions would affect Europe's access to key materials. That warning struck a sensitive nerve. Europe's green energy programs, defense manufacturers, and semiconductor industry all depend on rare earths, most of which are refined in China. The numbers tell the story. In 2023, the European Union imported more than 6,000 tons of rare earth materials from China, making up 46% of its supply. Another 28% came from Russia. Together, these two nations supply almost 80% of what Europe needs. Even if the EU tries to pivot toward suppliers like Australia or Malaysia, global refining capacity simply cannot meet the demand. Prices for key elements, neodymium and dysprosium, used in wind turbines and electric motors, have already jumped more than 25% since mid-2024, and could double again if China restricts exports. European officials know the risk. This isn't just leverage, it's structural dependence. Consider ASML, the Netherlands' flagship semiconductor company and global leader in extreme ultraviolet lithography. Every EUV machine it produces relies on rare earths such as neodymium, praseodymium, terbium, dysprosium, and yttrium, all processed in China. Even with stockpiles, production would stall if China reduced supply. After the Nexperia takeover, leaked reports suggested Chinese managers in European facilities were quietly instructed to follow Beijing's directives rather than local ones. Within days, Dutch officials sought behind-the-scenes talks with Beijing, an early sign of rising anxiety. Europe's push for strategic autonomy has exposed its own vulnerabilities. By targeting Chinese firms, it risks losing access to the very materials needed to sustain its technological future. If China decides to tighten the flow of rare earths, Europe's clean energy goals, semiconductor ambitions, and EV production lines, from ASML to battery factories, could be left stranded. China controls the minerals, the refineries, and the ports. The United States holds the tariffs, rising deficits, and political gridlock. Europe sits between them, discovering how fragile economic independence can be when your supply chain depends on others. This is no longer a simple trade dispute. It is a gradual but decisive reshaping of global power. From nations that borrow to nations that build, from consumption-driven economies to production-driven ones. Every new tariff, every sanction, every corporate seizure marks another shift in the global balance of wealth. The real question isn't who wins the next headline battle. It's who can withstand the pressure the longest. The country running on surplus, or the country forced to borrow just to stay in the game.